troubleshooting compost, bokashi, and worm farm systems. I'll start with rodents and rats, as you can see over here. Rodents and rats, they're going to tend to come in for two reasons. One, in a compost system, they love the warmth. They'll create little tunnels, perfect spot to raise their family. They'll also come in if you're putting in seeds, grains, bread, things that they like to eat. So try not to put those into a compost system. Pop them into maybe a bokashi first, or pre-soak them until they're rotting and then throw them in. But if you do find that they move in, simple thing to do is basically disrupt them. So treat them a bit like the unwanted house guest that just won't leave, and flip that couch and hose it down, and then flip it and hose it down again. So get in there with your compost turner and turn it and aerate it. Get it nice and wet. They don't want their environment too wet, and they don't love their tunnels and dens being collapsed. So if you do that consistently, they will move on and find somewhere else to live, and your compost will be free from rodents. So just do that every now and again. The next issue is smells. So smells can happen in all three systems, so compost, bokashi, and worm farms. In bokashi systems, there'll always be a bit of a smell. It should be sort of an apple cider vinegar smell, or depending on what you've put in the bin. I've experienced quite an orangey smell when we've had a lot of orange peels. I've experienced a very coffee smell when it's been in an office. They're fine. And an apple cider vinegar or that fermenty kind of smell, almost a kombucha smell, that's fine. But if you're getting a rotting smell that just smells like food rotting, like garbage rotting, it means that your enzymes, either there aren't enough of them, or the ones that you've put in perhaps have expired on their shelf life and died. So in terms of shelf life, if you've got the powder, whether it's a bran or a grain or a sawdust-based powder, that has a shelf life of up to 3 years. But if you're using a liquid, it has a shelf life of just a week or two. So you need to keep feeding it sugar to keep those little enzymes alive. So make sure you're using a quality enzyme, and make sure you're using enough of it. So pop some of that in. Popping in a little bit of warm water and brown sugar can help speed them up as well, because it just gives them a bit to eat to get their population right up. If you're getting smells on a worm farm or a compost bin, like a rotting smell, it simply means you don't have enough oxygen in there. So your system might be a bit wet and compressed, or it might just need a really good turn. So get in there with your turner in a compost system or in a worm farm. Get in there, get some gloves on, get in and fluff it all up, turn it all over, and get that air distributing through there, and that should really help. If it is still really wet after you've done that, rip up some dry corrugated cardboard and mix that through as well. Dry cardboard is your friend for everything. Again, if your systems are too wet, bokashi can be fine to be wet, but compost and worm farms don't want to be too wet. So if you can get some dry corrugated cardboard and just mix that through. So mosquitoes obviously is the sign for wetness. You might have mosquitoes breeding in there if it's that wet. But yeah, mixing through that dry cardboard can really help soak up that moisture and balance it out. The next one over here we have, they look like these giant flies. They're actually vinegar flies, and they are tiny. So they're those little flies that kind of float around in front of your face. If you've got some tomatoes on the bench that are a bit overripe, they come in looking for those, drawn in by those amazing ripening gases called ethylene. We can't smell them, but they can. They are attracted to compost systems simply because they release that gas. Now, what the difference is, if you end up with a plague, is if your system is quite acidic and quite wet, they will actually stick around and breed there as opposed to just visit. So small amounts are fine. Don't stress if you've got small amounts. But if you lift the lid of your worm farm or compost bin and cop a face full of sickness from all those vinegar flies, that's a plague. And that will mean that your system is too wet, too acidic, or both. So again, get in there and aerate it, and get in there with your dry cardboard and mix them through, and that will help disrupt that breeding cycle. And within a couple of breeding cycles, you should find that population disperse. Other issues you might encounter are mold. If you overload your compost bin or worm farm more than the system can take, you might end up with a bit of mold. Now, that white mold there if you get that in your bokashi, absolutely fine. It's the green and black mold. It's a different species of mold. That's the one that's very dangerous for us to breathe and isn't really helpful to the system. So white mold's fine, but if you're getting these molds, a couple of things you can do with the compost system is when you're putting the foods and things in, don't just put them on top, dig them in a little bit and then cover them over with some of the other compost. That can really help prevent the mold. In a worm farm, using a worm blanket can really help. You don't have to go out and buy a worm blanket. You can use a pizza box, corrugated cardboard, an old cotton towel, anything, any natural fibre is fine. I tend to avoid carpets and things because they're full of glues and synthetics and yuckies. Finally, worms dying. Now, in a compost system, worms can come and go unless it's a tumbler. Worms can just disappear off into the ground when it's really hot or the conditions just don't suit them. That's fine, they're safe. But if they're in a worm farm, there is no escape. And if it's a hot, hot day or several hot days in a row, that can really impact them. So during summer, especially, first of all, check your position. Make sure they're not in a spot that gets even an hour of sun, because an hour of sun is more than enough. Think about a parked car in the sun with a dog in it. An hour is more than enough to cause a fatality. So keep them out of the sun, and then you will find over many, many hot days, the substrate inside the worm farm actually heats up. So if you put your hands in, you'll be like, gosh, it feels quite warm. Look, it heats up anyway because decomposition creates heat. So what you can do, throw some of your fruit and veggie scraps in the freezer and then pop them in frozen as a natural cooling system. If you haven't thought ahead, which is fine, it happens to the best of us, grab a few ice blocks and throw them in. And that just allows the worms to move towards the ice blocks or away from the ice blocks to help regulate their own temperature, and it helps cool down the farm.